Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? Excellent. What a nice crowd we have here. Oh, well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Suzanne Johnson. I'm the interim campus president at Sylvania campus, which I'm loving. Everybody asks. It's 4 months in, still loving it, all good. I'm so happy that actually you've chosen to join us today for what I'm kind of viewing. Hopefully it's appropriate for me to consider it this way. This is the kickoff event for the 2014-2015 academic year of the Internationalization Initiative. And I'm very excited about this event and about the initiative overall. And since I was new to PCC, and some of you might be, or you don't know the background, I wanted to give you a little bit of history about this initiative. The seeds of it actually took root back in 2006, when a very small group of faculty, staff, and administrators returned from some international seminars and said, basically, how can we keep this going? And what are the steps that we could take to bring international education to PCC? So with that quickly said, by 2007, an agreement was already made with Portland State University for International Studies and the Asian Studies Focus Award. In the spring of 2008, 135 people gathered together in a summit that would eventually transform our curriculum and deepen our knowledge of people and cultures from around the world. The transformation occurred through a variety of classes, workshops, symposiums, and events, much like this today, that we're gathered here to listen to. I'm pleased to welcome a fellow community college instructor to our campus today. Samira Hussein is visiting us from Johnson County Community College in Overland Park, Kansas. We were just talking briefly. I'm an original Midwesterner, so we were comparing some notes there. I want to say a little bit about Ms. Hussein. She is a professor of business administration, and she began teaching at Johnson in 1995. She primarily teaches management and finance, but she does much more than teach, much more. Holding a master's degree in business administration and also a master's of science in clinical psychology from Central Missouri State University. She is also an international speaker, lecturing in China, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. She's a Fulbright scholar. She's a promoter of financial literacy. She's an author of curriculum on international business. She's also currently working with the International Education Office at Johnson County Community College and the Institute of Business Administration in Pakistan, of which she is a native, to set up the first group of community colleges in that country. She is with us today as a result of meeting Bryan Hull, PCC's instructor in English and World Languages at the East-West Center, where they were taking part in a Title VI grant in Asian Studies program development. I'm very eager to hear Ms. Hussein speak today, and I'm pleased to welcome both Samira Hussein and Bryan Hull.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Okay, this hour will go by really fast, so let's get to it. I thought we'd start by talking about the history of covering or veiling, but in a non-Muslim context. And because I noticed that in the news, I listen to NPR a lot, and whenever they talk about covering, it's always now connected to Islam. It's like those two things are wedded at the hip now.
Yes.
But I don't think it's always been the case. So I'm curious what historical perspective you might give us.
Let me start by saying I think I noticed that there are a lot of Muslims and non-Muslims even, but let me start by saying Salaam alaikum to all of you, which I think many of you probably know by now. Can everybody hear me? Know that it means peace be on you, because the root word is salam. And I am indeed grateful to Dr. Hull here, who has invited me, and Dr. Johnson was very gracious in inviting me over to share some thoughts today. I want to sort of preface that my thoughts are not adequate. I mean, they are representing, hopefully, the Muslim faith, but they are uniquely my own as well, because we all have our life journeys, and that brings us where we are. So with that said, let me start by answering the question that you asked, Bryan, which is an excellent one, because as Bryan said, that I think Islam and veiling has been sort of juxtaposed in the minds of our psyche, so to speak. But historically, if you look back, the Assyrian law had it pretty much codified that women were to be veiled, and that goes back to the ancient Babylonian cultures, the Mesopotamian cultures, except I think in early Egypt, when you look at it, women were not veiled. But that being said, the idea was that women who had certain stature, that had status, they were veiled. And in fact, if you look historically, it's rather interesting that women of ill repute, or those who were considered slaves or prostitutes, if they deemed veiled to gain stature, they were treated very harshly. And that's where I think that whole psyche comes in, where we start to think about how the males dictated whether or not a certain woman would be veiled. So if you had the stature, you were worthy enough to be veiled, but if you were not holding that status, you would then be considered not worthy of veiling. And so then we kind of go into history where, and we can talk about that from another perspective, but how colonialism comes in to these parts where Islam had started to spread, and their influence, and that consequently goes into deveiling. And then, of course, since more or less in the 70s, how veiling has again started to take vogue. So I think we have started to see come full cycle from women of status having that privilege, and now sort of being considered the subservient, oppressed woman who veils. So I thought it was rather ironic and interesting at the same time.
We should probably get out on the table what the Islamic rule is stated in the Quran or the Hadith about veiling.
So as we know, the Islamic culture does not make a distinction between the secular and the religious, and it's an entire way of life. And as Bryan mentioned, that we get the injunctions from the Quran, which is the holy book, and it is a continuation of the Judeo-Christian belief system. And then what is not concretely found is then you look into the practices of Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, and that is considered the Hadith. And so the Quran uses the word hijab. And literally the word hijab means seclusion. And those of you who are Arabic speakers, because Arabic is not my native language, although I'm married to an Egyptian now, and therefore we do have a little bit more going on in terms of conversational Arabic. Hijab literally means seclusion or curtain of veiling or separation. And interestingly, in the Quran, the term hijab is considered a veil between, let's say, the allowable and what is not allowed, the haram and the halal, what is lawful and unlawful, or having a hijab between modesty and piety and so forth, in terms of how we can create a curtain between the temptations of what we feel. But in the context of women and veils, specifically, there are 3 verses that are clearly an injunction in terms of how women have to keep their piety, their modesty, and 2 of the verses have historical context. Therefore, there is a little bit more of the Hadith connotation behind those verses. although the third verse, there are scholarly sort of, I would say the conjecture is that there is no clearly hadith that sort of that gives the background for that particular verse. But in general, the injunction is that women who are the believers are to keep the veil from their head to their bosoms, and in context of that, their behavior, their everyday practices are to be pious and modest, if you will. So there are those verses that are called the hijab verses in the Quran.
Now I know that each country has its own history with this topic, and it almost becomes absurd to talk about the Muslim world in a general way, because what happens in Turkey is very different from what happens in Pakistan versus Iran versus Morocco. So let's just get that on the table, that history impacts how women deal with this issue over time and differently in each context. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So having said that, do you notice any trends in contemporary Islamic life in Muslim countries that you, like, oh, even though things are very different, I'm noticing that there's some commonalities, or no?
I would say yes, generally, because if you look at the Islamic countries like Pakistan or Indonesia or Malaysia or Egypt, in North Africa or Morocco, where I did my Fulbright, it seems that there is a resurgence to validate oneself through taking the ownership of one's faith and one's identity. Some of this may be rooted in the political dynamics of the day, so to speak, but in general, there's a search for the Muslim identity, and therefore the resurgence of the veil, or to be able to express, and that would certainly be true for myself. So really the answer is yes, the phenomena of veiling is in some respects the backlash, if you will, to what has happened in terms of losing one's culture through foreign influences, through primarily colonization, whether it is the French experience in Algeria or whether it is the British influence that I personally grew up in convent schools in Pakistan, or for that matter, the British influence in Egypt, if you will, and today what happens on the streets of Cairo or in the streets of Karachi in Pakistan, or whether it is what I see happening in the diaspora of Muslim populations in Europe. I see that as very much a trend.
So, let's talk about Pakistan, and let's talk about how it's changed or how it's the same from the point that you grew up to the point it is now. And I wonder, my assumption is that how you dress and whether you have a beard has taken on more importance in contemporary Pakistan than when you grew up, but I could be wrong. So I'm curious about what new meaning has happened in Pakistan post 9/11 and how it's different from when you were growing up as a wee Samira.
Well, that's an interesting question because, and I don't want to date myself by any
We can
means.
keep it vague, okay? Back in the old days.
Back in the old days. Okay, we can keep it very generalized. We are still a fairly young nation, I would say, 66 years old or so. So coming out of this experience of colonization, if you will, the idea was that the more of a Britisher you are, whether you spoke in that intonation or whether you went to British grammar schools or whether you had the ability to conduct your daily life, which obviously one could demonstrate in the way one dressed, the better chances you had of economically being a success, because you identified with the master race, if you will. And so right after the partition, when India and Pakistan were divided into two separate nation states, the idea was to identify with the colonizers who had just left us, with the law, with the legal system, the social system, the economic systems, all sort of made according to their experiment, if you will, in our part of the world. So consequently, in the rural areas, you would have still found the cultures that was more traditional, more authentic, if you will. But in the urban areas where the convent schools were, or the British schools were, you had an elitism, if you will. And so one naturally expected parents to send their young kids, daughters as well. And my family was no exception, that both my parents, who are deceased, and God bless them, they always felt the value of education. So therefore, in order for us to get the best, they sent us to the convent schools. So my appreciation growing up for Islam or its value systems was sort of, if you can imagine, being constructed by the Catholic nuns who were our primary instructors of Islamic education. And so consequently, the language and its appreciation for literature, for our rich poetic history, was all constructed as if I was a foreigner living in my own land. Well, now fast forward this to the Iranian Revolution that takes place in 1980, 79, 80.
My students, by the way, they're reading Persepolis right now, and they have to write a paper on this. So students, pay attention.
So it suddenly sort of created that Islamization phenomena. So from a personal perspective, I would not dream of being dressed the way I am right now. My siblings, of course, would be considered fairly moderate. My mother never veiled, although traditional cultures were followed, so to speak. So when this Islamic revolution takes place in Iran, all of a sudden you see the TV announcers on Pakistani television, they are covering, and they are overnight sort of randomly taking away all these remnants of the liberal culture, if you will, like the casinos that we had growing up in Karachi, the big hotels where you had a lot of tourists that were coming in with their particular influences and so forth. All of that started to gradually disappear.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So then you start to also see that wave of Islamization and fundamentalist value system being suddenly appropriated. And in fact, science books being written with something to the tune of, if God willing, you take 2 parts of hydrogen, and God willing, you take 1 part of whatever, and you combine it, this is how you get water. And your mind does a number that how did we go from such liberal attitude to such conservatism? And so then, of course, as a young girl, I left the country, and I have now since then been here. So looking back now, and obviously having my parents there until 2009 and 2010, when they both died, and still keeping an eye, keeping one foot in the culture, I would say that the country has always tried to find its identity. Because Pakistan literally means the land of the pure, and other than Israel, Pakistan, it's a little known fact, was actually founded on the basis of Islamic ideology. But what brand of Islam, what form of Islam, we never really had a clear picture. And unfortunately, the father of the nation, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he died shortly after the birth of
Now, wait a
Pakistan.
second. Am I wrong? I had always heard that he was very secular in his creation. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're very right. He was a barrister, educated in England and so forth. But at the time of partition, he was a very strong advocate that the Muslims in the subcontinent should be allowed to practice Islam. And therefore, he saw a justification of what Islam and Pakistan would be created in the name of the Islamic ideology, so to speak. But what was his brand of ideology? I think Pakistan, and in this respect, women and cultural values and all is still being sort of discovered, if you will.
Okay, so you're in the US. At what point do you decide to veil and why?
Okay, so that's also a very interesting question and a very personal one.
You don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
No, I'd love to, because I think this is also an existential question for me personally. Like any other young woman coming to the United States, I think, or any immigrant experience, I think the first sense, and I think a lot of us who are first-generation immigrants would probably say that we are all wanting to assimilate, acculturate, because I think it's a natural phenomena that the more other I feel, the more homesickness I will feel. So the more I assimilate, the more I will feel at home. And you start to gradually roll your R's a little, you start to go ahead and pick up the cues from the popular culture, and your mannerisms start to change. And I think that's sort of what happens on a very basic level. And that's what was my experience. And having gone through my education, having then going through my professional life, I was sort of still in the process of assimilation, but yet, like I mentioned, my parents were living, my family, my siblings had migrated. My sister lives in Australia, my niece is in England, so we are all sort of spread around. And in 2009, within 10 days, I lost my mother. And you know, you just sort of, it hits you. Who am I? What am I doing on this earth? Am I going to be the next? And how is this going to, what do I know about myself? So you know you're a Muslim, you have an identity, you pray, you read the Quran, and you sort of fast, but you do this on a sort of an autopilot, if you will. I mean, you have a consciousness, but you really don't intellectualize what you are practicing, if you will. And right at that point, it seems that somewhat fortuitously, as I lost my mother, I was getting ready to meet my future husband as well, who was a major influence in my life, and he came to almost like question me, who are you, what do you want from life? And I think that started that journey, and I realized that when I was in the mosque, I would be covered, but the minute I stepped out of the mosque, or the minute I would stop praying at home, I would then go about my business. And I never really thought that I could combine my spiritual and secular until I lost my mother. And thereupon, I realized that there was no, it didn't have to be mutually exclusive. So therefore, that led me to my journey, and I decided that once I wear the scarf, I need to keep it on, and then discover myself in my predominant environment and see how I feel. And then it was one of the most difficult things I did, because a lot of questions came and a lot of otherness started. But being the stubborn person I am, I decided that it was worth the effort. It was worth the journey. And today, I can't imagine not being without it.
So first of all, it was very powerful, that story about your mom and her influence on you. And beyond that, And it's probably the thing I'll remember the most, like years from now, when I've forgotten everything else about this talk, I'll still think about that. So that's important. So let's talk about how people responded to you, both Muslims and non-Muslims, when suddenly you are veiling. What happened? You're in Kansas?
Yes, I am in the good old Midwest, heart of Kansas. Well, that was interesting. I was single, and I was not veiling. So I think my male colleagues had always generally sort of approached me as if I was approachable in terms of me being another person from another, just generally being one of them. But all of a sudden, I think that the perception was that who did this to you? Like, was it somebody like your brother or a man, or somebody just came in and then summarily forced you? So that was the most often asked question, if you will. And then actually some things were pretty, I thought, funny, because somebody asked me, do you have cancer? And I said, no, not really. And I think others were like mostly curious. But I think generally, once I became okay with it, they were okay with it.
Really?
In the sense that I think there was this perception that somehow I'm going to be different. I'm not going to be me. I'm going to lose the core of who I am. And I think they realized that, for the lack of a better term, I'm always going to be a hyphenated Muslim. I have very much an American identity that I couldn't lose. And because I've lived here longer than I've lived in Pakistan. And so therefore, once they became okay that I was still going to have the same sense of humor, I was still going to be able to speak English the way I did, I was not going to go ahead and start reciting the Quran every chance I got, I think they were okay with it.
Huh. And what about Muslims?
I'm sorry?
What about, you talked about, it sounded like you were talking about non-Muslims and their response, so what about the Muslim community?
That was also an interesting thing, because I think a lot of the Muslim community that saw me, a lot of women especially, because once you go into the Islamic public spaces, these are definitely segregated spaces. So a lot of the Muslim women that were covering obviously welcomed me, felt like I was also part of the community. And I think there is a certain persona that we all carry, because I probably, a lot of the women in the community are housewives, or if they're professional women. So sort of we have those personas, if you will. And I think I was always being considered the professor in the community, so to speak. My Muslimness was probably secondary. But to answer your question, I think the ones who were veiling obviously were very elated, excited for me. The ones who were not veiling asked me all kinds of questions. How did you do it? How did you get the nerve or the strength to be who you are? And how did you not fear the backlash, especially in the post 9/11 world and what have you? So that dialogue still continues with those Muslim women.
So I have something, an experience, a thought that occurred to me. We were talking briefly before we started about how I was in Turkey a couple years ago. I don't know how many years now. And the seminar that I was in, there was a lot of talk throughout the seminar about veiling. And in Turkey, there's a very unique history of that. That up until recently, you couldn't go into a public building if you were veiled. So there were endless discussions about this. And at some point, I remember sitting there thinking, you know, this is just another example of people obsessing about what women look like. And I I just didn't want to engage in the conversation anymore. Because people care 10 times more about that than they ever care about men and various issues. And so I wonder what you think about that. Do you sometimes think, oh my, it's as far as a feminist perspective on this, like at some point a feminist perspective is just acceptance and could we please not talk about this anymore? I wonder what you think about that.
I think that's also a very insightful observation, because I think sometimes we make it so reductive, if you will, that I am sort of reduced to this piece of cloth which sort of gives me my entire persona. And to me, we can go beyond that, because there's a person here. It's like every time I ran into somebody who's wearing a tie and a suit, I would construct this persona about this person and go from those assumptions and not see Bryan for who Bryan is. I think that would be doing the disservice to you as a unique individual. And I completely agree with that I think women choose to veil for different reasons. I mean, mine was more of an existential angst that I felt. Somebody else may be because of culture that they were born in and they took it for granted. Somebody else may be because they are, as a second generation, living in a conservative household, are wanting to psychologically resist themselves from a temptation of what the predominant culture has to offer. So if you were to do the research and ask Muslim women on campuses, for instance, why do you choose to cover? Somebody may say, well, this is my identity, this is what I grew up with, and this is what I want. But somebody else might say, once I wear the veil, I look and I feel differently, therefore I do not engage with things that are not part of my value system. So it becomes a barrier to some of the issues that may not be part of your comfort zone. And I think if we can take it for whatever varied reasons we bring to the table, then I think it becomes an easier way to deal with it, rather than to just sort of conflate a lot of different cross-sections. If you are a Muslim woman, you are veiling, then you must be dealing with a patriarchal system, and therefore we are going to come and liberate you from a feminist approach. And if I can diverge a little bit, I think a lot has been made in the media recently about Malala Yousafzai, the young lady who has taken such a bold stance. And I think part of me is, of course, very proud as a Pakistani Muslim American woman that Malala is so celebrated. But part of me is really disappointed, because I see Malala being taken as an epitome of how the West has liberated her from Talibanization, and how, therefore, there's an entire political agenda, if you will, on we are the ones that are rescuing these people who have no rights. And I think that's where I have a little bit of a problem, that fundamentally Malala's message is couched in Islamic value on education. But that is not what the media has picked up on.
No, not Islamic value. No, it gets turned, the Islamic part gets
sort of overshadowed.
Yeah, value of education.
Exactly.
Right. So two of us have been talking for a while now, and I want to make sure that you all get to enter the conversation. So I warned you 30 minutes ago that you'd have to have some interesting things to ask. So let's open it up. What do you all think? What do you want to say? Don't be shy. This audience is amazing, by the way. Yes?
So
So I was very happy to hear that part of this conversation came to the feminist piece of why are we always going to be, why is there all this focus and attention on what women are wearing and how different that is from how that attention goes to men. So I want to honor that point. I have another aspect that I'd like to ask you about, because I think on another level, as a woman, there are questions that I have that have to do with approaching somebody and not being insulting, for example. So, like, there are other heritage cultures where women cover themselves. And like in some of those cultures, women who cover their hair would never wear pants. Those two things wouldn't happen together. And you can kind of tell the level of, I mean, because I know it, because I'm schooled in it, I know which women that I encounter in those cultures would not be shaking hands with a man, and that some of those things do impact how I would interact with them. I mean, somewhat. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm, as not knowing anything, I don't know if you're wearing pants and you're covering your head, are you, like in these other cultures, you're more orthodox, you're more observant if you're not in pants. But I don't know those kinds of things about, having a veil in the United States or here at PCC, for example. So could you speak to that?
Absolutely, and I think that's a good question. That is a very insightful question. I would approach it that from an Islamic perspective, Islam gives a lot of latitude in terms of because you see, there is no concept of a central authority figure, as let's say in Catholicism, where each Muslim is instructed to read the book and follow the teachings of the Prophet as they interpret it. So there's a lot of room for discussion and interpretation. What I have as an attire may be considered a paradox for some cultures, where a Muslim sister in the audience may be completely wearing a loose robe. But then again, who's to say that a certain robe, which is so embellished and which has got so much of attention to the attire, may be not appealing to another person compared to a very drab pair of slacks and a shirt. So I think it becomes somewhat individual choice in terms of how I choose to obey, to remain pious, and to practice my modesty within my own attire. I don't have to, I can never be an Arab because I wasn't born one, and that is not part of my cultural tradition. Arabs, although they are conflated in the media as equal to Islam, but you have Arab Christians, you have Arab Jews, you have Arab Muslims. My attire has never been the long robe. So therefore, that is not part of my identity. I don't know if I answered your question.
But it's not a question of if you're wearing a robe, you're more strict as in your...
That may be ethnocentric to that particular cultural system. So if I was to reside, let's say, in inner cities of Pakistan, this would be considered maybe very, very brazen on my part to wear this. But I would not want to stick out. I would not want to then just wear a hijab and then contradict myself, because this is not part of the attire in the rural community of Pakistan. But I don't particularly have ever faced a conflict that as a business professor in Midwest, I cannot have an identity of a professional woman still remaining true to my values and beliefs by wearing what I choose to wear. So that's where I think I find personal liberation in making that choice.
Okay, someone else. Don't be shy. Yes.
So I was struck by, first of all, fascinating, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
I was really struck by a moment in your narrative today when you were discussing significant loss of your mother. And I'm hoping I'm interpreting this correctly, that it precipitated within you a re-examination of self and identity. And in your gaining of your individual identity, it enhanced, I believe the word you used was otherness. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
I think, as I spoke before, that the loss of myself through that assimilation process, I always wondered where I belonged. I mean, yes, I did know that I belonged to a certain family, to a certain culture, to a certain cultural tradition, if you will. But in trying to just go through that assimilation, I had summarily lost a part of myself. And I think in the heart of Midwest, when you start to lose that self, you are no longer true to your values, and you start to lose your convictions in yourself. And at some point, you have lost your central core. And that became very problematic for me because I just felt lost at so many different levels. So the loss of my mother also triggered the loss of myself in me, and that was something that I was not prepared to live with. I eventually had to come to terms with the fact that I had lost my soul. That was my mother. I was extremely close to her. And being single all my life, that was my primary family, so to speak. But the loss of self was something that I couldn't keep up with anymore. And I think when I discovered that I could take that part that I had lost in that assimilation, I could be at peace. That was something that was precious. I don't know if I answered that.
You did an amazing answer. It was even more powerful than before.
Thank you.
Have you ever had a moment when you wish you were not wearing it?
Have I had a moment where I wish I was not wearing the veil right now? There is a vain woman in me every day. Oh, yes, absolutely. There is not a day that goes by that, you don't see the beautiful faces and you wonder, wow, her hair looks pretty. I wish I could curl it that way. Yes, I'm human. I'm very much human. And I think God bless the American marketing genius, there is a lot of emphasis. It wouldn't be a multi-billion dollar industry if we didn't put so much emphasis in ourselves in terms of our public images. But I think once I pin my scarf on in the morning, I am coming with a psychological peace that I'm stepping out in the world, and in a lot of ways, it reminds me, it enhances, it forces me to examine the core values. How long am I here on this earth? What is my interaction in this moment in time? What is my authentic self? Will I be alive tomorrow, or is this today the last day? It's not in sense of sadness or gloom, but it reminds me to enjoy the moment, to celebrate God's blessings on me. And so with every day when I wear a veil, I lose that vanity, but I gain so much more.
I wonder if it's similar to things that you experience when you pray. The things you just described seem to me things that would also happen when you pray. Is that true?
Absolutely, because as you well know, or maybe you don't know, that Muslims are enjoined to pray 5 times a day. And so I was at the Rock Creek campus, and believe me, this is a beautiful, beautiful place. I don't know how anybody could not admire God's blessings and grace on all of you in terms of all the beauty that you are around. And so once I got done, I sort of thought, well, I think I'll just postpone the prayer and make it up once I'm done with the talk. But then I told Bryan, no, could I get a few moments? And again, that reminds you that these are precious blessings, and these are the moments that will not come back in time. So wearing that veil is almost an act of worship, which I would lose out on if I was to blindly pursue my vain worldly self, if you will.
Your fabulous hair. Okay, someone else. I think we have time for one more. Yes?
So my questions aren't, unfortunately, as a part of your mental and spiritual experience, but more technical, I guess. I'm ignorant on whether or not the Quran mentions modesty towards men and them covering their heads or their bosoms. And also, what are the different pieces of the hijab? Is it just the head? I mean, is the hijab just referred to as the head covering, or is it also the robe? I mean, is there a different word for the robe?
Okay, so that is also a good question. The head covering, hijab, is normally with the, it's for a lack of a better term, is translated as veil. But then the loose body covering could be jilbab. It could be also khimar, which is like a head covering that is almost like a nun's wimple, if you will, that I don't think we see much more, but many times. But for the men also, the injunction is to dress modestly. It's not just for women. And I think righteousness is not something, there's no law that says that I would be punished if I didn't, but in the sense that I'm encouraged. I am, it's an act of piety, modesty, if you will. But there are different parts of the covering. If I think, like in Afghanistan, the culture, which is also the same culture in north of Pakistan, there is burqa, which is the whole long robe with almost a little small covering for opening for the eyes. Now, one asks, why that? Is that also an injunction? Again, the verses of the Quran are open to interpretation. I'm not an Islamic scholar, neither do I claim to be one. But I personally believe that anthropologically, those cultures that had a certain cultural system in place before Islam came, those systems have definitely influenced the culture that is practiced in the way women choose to demonstrate their piety. So the Malaysian women may have a little different attire than, let's say, the Saudi women or the Afghani women or the Iranian women, if you will. And I think culture has played a large role in choosing the attire, so to speak.
Do you feel like there's a trend for the current attire for men changing?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very well.
Is there an attire for men as much as there are for women?
The attire for men, again, is I would say that beard is an act of following the Sunnah, because the Prophet, peace be on him, used to have always a beard, but the length of the beard or the way one chooses to have is also subject to one's own will, if you will. But as far as the male attire is concerned, obviously one has a pretty good consciousness when one is dressing provocatively, whether a male or a female. And I think that, again, it is not to say that if a male is dressed in a Western attire, he is immodest, but the one who's wearing a long gown is more modest. That is, to me, at least in my limited interpretation, is a cultural manifestation of how one chooses to exemplify one's faith.
Okay, I want everyone to thank Samira for coming.